podcast, The Artist, and it is so lovely to see you again after a few years. You're looking healthy and wealthy.
Yeah, thank you. You look healthy as well.
It's been raining heavily in Mumbai. How are things there in Chicago?
Functional right now.
Yeah, the last time we were talking about who's your audience, and this time, when we started doing book recommendations, I realized that this book, This Is Orson Welles, has been edited by you, and I was like, how come we've not discussed this in our last session? And I thought this was a great time to get it on board with you again and see how you feel about the book after so many years that you worked on the book. So, how was it working on the book at that time?
Well, it was a fascinating thing. I mean, the reason why I got the job is I became friends with Oya Kodar, who had the rights to the book. And the first projects that we had together was I was very eager to publish a script by Orson Welles called The Big Brass Ring, which I think is proof that not only he was a very fine writer, but also that he could have been a terrific novelist, because it's very much like a novel. Um, and then we also did another script of his called The Cradle Will Rock. And then she asked me, to edit this book. Um, and it was a long-term, fascinating kind of job because it involved a lot of research. One thing that actually I want to bring up because it just seems like it's a slight irritation to me is Walter Murch has just come out with a new book, and he has a chapter devoted to the re-edit of Orson Welles' Touch of Evil, which was based on a memo a very lengthy memo that Welles wrote in post-production, during post-production on Touch of Evil. In any case, Walter mentions everybody who worked on the project except for me, and praises everybody, but I don't get mentioned at all. The reason why I think is because there were a couple of cases where I overruled Walter Murch, where he did something that I objected to, and the producer decided in my favor. So that's why he's annoyed with me. But at the same time, he never would have heard of the memo if I hadn't published it. I was the one who actually brought it out into the world in this book. It originally got cut out of the first printing of This Is Orson Welles because it went over the space and they were worried. But I insisted on it being included in the paperback second edition. And I meanwhile had published 2/3 of the memo in both in English and in French, in Film Quarterly in the United States and in Trafic in France. So that's the reason why anybody knows about the memo, because I introduced it to the world. So anyway, it's a little annoying to me that Walter doesn't want to even acknowledge that, because I guess his ego is hurt or something. Of good news I can report on Orson Welles' work becoming available is that all the footage for Don Quixote is finally getting turned over to a Cinematheque in Madrid. And so we hope eventually people will be able to see it. Based on what I've seen, I think it's the major unseen work by Orson Welles. The version that was released under the name Don Quixote in Spain, that was put together by Jesus Franco, doesn't really qualify as Don Quixote at all, because he included parts of an Italian documentary that Welles made in order to raise money for Don Quixote. But all the best footage from the film Don Quixote, which is with Patty McCormick, isn't included in the Jesus Franco version. So anyway, it's very good news that it's finally going to be preserved and is eventually going to be visible, I would think. Even though it's an unfinished film, I do consider it the major Orson Welles film that nobody's seen. what
Right.
there is of it.
So, right. So, when you were working on this book, This is Orson Welles, when you were working on the book, did you get to meet Orson Welles?
Well, no, when the book came out, he was dead, but I met Orson Welles when he was alive, but that was when I was living in Paris in 1972 or 73. Actually, I wrote
Right.
him a letter when he was editing F for Fake, and he invited me to
Right.
lunch, actually. So I actually had lunch with Orson Welles. But I only
Wow.
would, but that was very exciting. And I basically said, the first question I asked him was why he invited me to lunch. And he said, because I don't have time to answer your letter, actually. Um, and it was basically, I was asking him, I was writing an article about his first major film project, Heart of Darkness, which was the film he was originally planned to make before Citizen Kane, and had to cancel it because it was too expensive. But it was a more experimental project than Citizen Kane was, and a fascinating project. Anyway, yeah, he
Wow.
died, and I only met Oya after he died, and then we became friends. And then she asked me to do the book, but he was had long been dead when I started work on the book.
Wow. So, he was long dead when you started working on the book. So, tell me, Jonathan, sir, what did you, while you were working on the book, who was Orson Welles, the man? Did you sort of feel him?
Well, I think yeah, I mean, he's a complicated individual, obviously, and understanding who he really was is made all the more complicated by the fact that he was such a theatrical person. And so stories that he told and stories that other people told about him were always sort of
Yeah.
like tall tales, often, and exaggerated. And so my job was to basically to try to be truthful. So at the point is, one of his most famous stories was how he came to, adapt the book that was became Lady from Shanghai. But that was almost completely made up by him. It was totally untrue. And so I had to mention in the editor's notes that it was untrue. But otherwise, I tried to sort of like, I did an awful lot of research. And, you know, the manuscript as it stands was written more by Wells than it was written by Bogdanovich, because he kept
Yes.
revising it. I had, you know, dozens and dozens of drafts of the manuscript. So it was an endless project of sort of sifting through and finding what was the best material. And I actually, the biggest problem I had with the book was that there was so much material that I had to find ways of economizing space. And that's why the Touch of Evil memo was originally cut out of the manuscript by the editor at Harper and Row, because they thought it was too I don't know, it was just too long. I mean, to me, it was a major document because it was one of the few times Wells explained his own artistic motivations for doing certain things, and that is makes it a very rare document. And also, it was an
Yeah.
extraordinary document in the sense that everything he said, I think we discovered while working on the film that it was true. That if we did the changes that he suggested, it made the film somewhat better, actually. Not everybody would agree
Hmm.
with us, but of course but at least that's my own conviction.
Right.
So,
Right.
so it was a really interesting experience, and it took me several years working on the book. I had to, the first job was going through reel to reel audio tape and actually
Yeah.
transcribing it, and then figuring out ways of editing it too. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So, when you were going through the audio tapes, Jonathan, sir, the interaction between Wells and Bogdanovich, did you get a peep into did you get any hint of who was Orson Welles as a man?
Well, I don't think that's an easy question to answer. He was many different people. We all are different people at different times, you know?
Yeah,
And he was an
yeah.
extraordinary individual, which made him even more complex. So I do think one of the things that I believed was that he was someone who told the truth more often than most people believe. And I found that
Hmm.
true even when I met him for lunch, you know, that he was actually trying to remember accurately. And when he wasn't sure of his memory, he told me to who else I should check with and so on. So I think he was capable of being quite honest, actually, which a lot of people don't
Hmm.
give him enough credit for, I think.
Hmm. Hmm. Wow.
Um, and
Wow. Hmm.
also, no matter how many people were critical of him in the United States, the best criticism
Hmm.
of Orson Welles was his own criticism of himself. He was very good, a very accurate critic of his own failings, I
Hmm.
think.
Hmm. Hmm. He was accurate about his own failings. Did you, by any
Yes.
chance, during your conversation with him and also while you were working on the book, was he a bitter man by the end of his life, before he
Well,
passed away? Because there's a line in the book that says that he realized that all man's achievements finally turned to dust. This is a line in the book, and he mentioned that you still everyone needs to keep singing. So was he? What was his?
well,
Was he a realized man? Yeah.
I think sometimes he was better, sometimes he wasn't. You know, I think
Hmm.
one of the problems with the other side of the wind, which I should say I'm glad it came out, but on the other hand, I strenuously disagree with the way it was edited. Even though I was a consultant on the film, none of my suggestions were followed. So I have to say that I think the problem with The Other Side of the Wind is that it's an anti Hollywood film that was edited by Hollywood professionals. So the way it was
Mm-hmm.
edited went against the grain of what he was intending, in my opinion. But at the same
Right.
time, and I think there is a lot of bitterness in that film, I think. But on the other hand, if you look
Hmm.
at what he was doing afterwards, towards the very end of his life on The Dreamers, which he shot, you know, half an hour of with Oya Kodar and Gary Graver, that's not a bitter film at all. So I think you could find
Hmm.
out almost anything you can say about Orson Welles, you can contradict by finding something else, you see, because I mean, I think he was a lot of different people, which I think is true of us all, everybody. You know, it's not like we're one person. We're different people at different times of the day, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know, when you
Yeah.
want to say, when people talk about wanting to make an unfinished film conform to his intentions change several times a day. So it's kind of like impossible to sort of say what Orson Welles' intentions were unless we fix it to one period of time because they changed all the time. He was constantly revising and creating. And one reason why some of the films never came out is he never stopped revising them.
Wow. Wow. So, Jonathan sir, he made a classic, Citizen Kane, which is still a classic. Till now, you talk about Citizen Kane and the shot takings and the impact of the film. And that film was made when he was barely 25, his first film,
Yes.
right after while he was doing theater. He managed to create a classic. And then he made 12 other films till the time he turned 70 when he passed away. What Why is the world so haunted by the classic called Citizen Kane, and why was Orson Welles trying to not have a conversation about Citizen Kane post while he was making other films, because everyone used to ask him about Kane?
Well, because you know, the popular mainstream position about him was he made one great film and then everything else was bad after that. which is totally untrue.
Mm,
I mean, it seems to me
mm,
that what we have of the Magnificent Ambersons already demonstrates
mm,
that in some way it was even more achieved than Citizen Kane. And the point
yeah.
is that he he's the exact opposite of somebody like Woody Allen, who does the same, basically does the same type of film with the same technique over and over again. Every time he changed and reinvented himself, and that's what's exciting about him. But he gets penalized for that because because the whole idea of the way the business works is finding what the public likes and then doing it again and again. And we have to remember that even Citizen Kane didn't make money when it came out. It was because it was, banned from all the theaters that were, the news, because it was a campaign against the film and it could only show in independent theaters. It was kind of like, there's something that goes on in American culture, which I call capitalist censorship, which exists on all kinds of levels all the time. Even the deletion of the memo from the first edition of This Is Orson Welles is an example of capitalist censorship. In other words, I think if
Mm,
it's not going to make money, then we can't do it. But there are a lot of things that are
mm,
very valuable, extremely valuable, that aren't necessarily profitable because it takes the public sometimes to get used to it. So it can't make money right away. So it's well suffered from this because the whole idea of the business is based on a reactionary idea that you imitate your last successful film, and Wells refused to do that. He always insisted on changing
wow.
and doing something new. And so that made him a commercial
Yeah.
liability. But at the same time, it made him a great artist. So sometimes, people pretend that making a great film and making a commercial success are somehow the same thing, but they're not the same thing. They're very different. Sometimes they're very different.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
occasionally you get an
Wow.
artist like Chaplin who can be both a great artist and be a very commercially successful artist.
Commercial.
But
Yeah.
very often,
Yeah.
if an artist is ahead of his time, then it doesn't work out that way. And Wells was a case where it didn't work out that way.
Wow, wow. So most occasionally, when an artist is ahead of his time, it does not work out with the artist when it comes to commerce and the art part. And that is such a great line. It's very rare that somebody like Chaplin is able to manage this, and throughout his career, most of them. That's
Yes, well,
so rare. That's
one
such a
thing
great point.
I can say that the two Orson Welles films that I worked on directly were Touch of Evil and The
Hmm.
Other Side of the Wind. In the case of Touch of
Yeah.
Evil, I can say with pride that release of that version was one of the only Orson Welles films that actually was profitable. It was a commercial success. But The Other
Hmm.
Side of the Wind, you know, it's never going to come out on DVD because Netflix, who owns the rights, don't think it's a bad film and it doesn't deserve to come out on DVD. I mean, this is crazy, but it just shows you how Orson Welles, even after his death, is still ahead of the curve. I mean, it's like they don't realize,
Yeah.
even though it's a difficult film, it may not even be a successful film, but to me, it's still 10 times more interesting than most films that come out. And the fact that it won't come out
Yeah.
on DVD is ridiculous, considering all the terrible stuff that, comes out on DVD every day. Uh, and
Yeah.
anyway, that's the problem that
Yeah.
continues, and that's what continues to keep Wells interesting, because he's ahead. He's
Yeah.
always ahead of us. It's not like we're never behind. Uh, and it wasn't even his conscious desire to be ahead of everybody. He wanted to have commercial successes. It's just that it was in his nature to basically be ahead of everybody else.
Wow. Wow. So he was ahead of the curve and he refused to repeat Citizen Kane, which was demanded of him after the success of Kane. He wanted to do other things. And so he was actually fighting for the art that he wanted to create. Do you think, Jonathan, sir, that he, because of the fight that he was doing, wanting to create the way he wanted to create, he was he was able to make 12 films throughout his career. What is it that uh, what is it that happened that the rest of independent production producers did not back him for the kind of films or the number of films he would have actually wanted to make?
Well, he was a very bad businessman. He couldn't, and literally, there was one thing that's really surprising when people learn about this. He never learned how to add and subtract. He couldn't do arithmetic at all, even. So there was a lot of ways in which he would alienate the people in control, the people who ran the studios. He got along fine with most of the people he worked with, but the people who were his bosses, he usually didn't get along with, and that also hurt him because he liked to sort of devise ways of, early in his career, he had the benefit of John Houseman as sort of a manager, and he never had somebody as good as John Houseman was, and sort of, you know, placating and holding at bay the kind of people who were in control, like the head of the studio or the producer and so on.
Yeah.
So I think the fact that he lacked such a person and insisted on running his own operations as a businessman was what harmed him because he wasn't very good at doing that.
Right. So his battles with the studios, which is prominently mentioned, where a law is, that's the reason he could not raise finance from the studios, because he had this consistent battles with the studios, and he was not ready to compromise at any point. He would rather create
That's
his
right.
own independent.
Yeah, oddly enough, he actually was socially friendly with all the heads of most of the heads of the studios. He was actually good friends with Darryl F. Zanuck, uh, who
Yeah.
actually put money into Othello, for example. And he was friends with, but at the same time, a working arrangement was not possible. See, one of the things that was really unusual about him before he even went to Hollywood, when he was putting on theater in New York, he would make all this money as a radio actor, and he would sink all of his own money into the productions, even though the productions, it was during the Depression, was supposed to be state financed. But they had extra money because of the money that he had that he would sink into them. So he had a kind of very unorthodox way of using his own money to help finance his. And then when he had less money later on, it became harder to do that. But that was one, and of course, from the point of view of Hollywood, to put your own money into your productions is madness. Like nobody in Hollywood would even think of doing that. But he did it all the time,
Yeah.
and that's one of the reasons why he was an outsider, because he did that. Same thing with Cassavetes. Cassavetes also put his own money into his own films. In other words,
Yeah.
it's somebody who
Yeah.
cared enough about his own work to pay for it. Whereas the
Yeah.
correct position from the point of view of Hollywood is to not care about your own work and basically to
Yeah.
get other people to invest money. Because just think about it as whether it's going to make money or not whether how good it is independently of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Why was Citizen Kane this big hit, this big classic? What was in Citizen Kane that till now it is considered as one of the
Well, I
most
think
important and classic films?
what's very impressive about it is the energy. But I think you find just as much energy in some of the later films. It's just that he didn't have total control. So they're battles of wills, which I think weaken them. I mean, I still
Right.
try to imagine what the rough cut of Lady from Shanghai, which was 3 hours long, would have been like. It sounds extraordinary, but it was sort of like So there's an awful lot of great material by Orson Welles that we've never seen and never will see because it was destroyed by the
Yeah.
studio.
Oh my God. It was destroyed by the studio?
Well, yes, I mean the cut footage from Magnificent Ambersons, a large part of It's All True, which would have been one of his great films, and was very radically anti-racist. This was a feature about Latin America in which all three of the lead characters were non-white. I mean, imagine that in that period in Hollywood. That's the real reason when they said he was spending too much money, he was out of control. It was really about ideology to some extent. He was politically radical when it came to that film, and he got chased out of Hollywood as a consequence. Because
Mm-hmm.
and so
Mm-hmm.
and fortunately we do have F for Fake, which he had total control over, even though it was a low budget film, and that's a film that came out exactly as he wanted it to. So the same thing happened with filming Othello, a documentary he made at the end of his career. So it's not that he
Yeah.
never had a chance to have total control again. It's just that he wasn't able to have full resources of his studio. See, I think the problem with his reputation in the United States is that in the US, Orson Welles is considered to be a failed Hollywood director, when in fact, I would rather describe him as a successful independent filmmaker who sometimes had the use of Hollywood equipment and facilities. And at Citizen Kane is the only time he had both the facilities and total control.
Right. Right. How did, Jonathan sir, your perspective, how did a man who has come from theater and has not gone to a film school manage to create a classic just
Well,
as a first film,
well,
right coming out of his, yeah.
he basically described that himself. It's because he had the right collaborators. Like
Hmm.
Greg Toland taught him, an awful lot about how to shoot a film or how you could shoot a film. And when he would think up impossible things to do because he didn't know any better, Greg Toland, instead of saying, no, you can't do that, would figure out ways of doing it, even, and was so, in other words, picking the right people to work with is the way he was able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Herman Mankiewicz, who was an old Hollywood regular, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. When you look back at the book now, when I'm talking to you, what do you feel? Do you think the perception, the things about Wells that people would have perceived while reading the book and now, after so many years, do you think that perception has changed? What do you think people think about Wells now?
Well, I do think to me, the most important message that I wanted to build into the book was that Orson Welles did more and accomplished more than any of us realized. Because, I mean,
Mm,
the thing that I worked on the longest was the career summary in the back of the book. And
mm,
and even though it's quite lengthy, it's still incomplete. That's the kind of
mm,
amazing thing when you study Orson Welles and you do research, you always find out that he did more than you thought he did, not less. So, in other words, people who called him lazy were totally wrong. He was a workaholic, and he constantly working. And even most of the films that he never even got to make, but which he scripted, he would do numerous drafts of the same script. The Dreamers are at least 12 drafts of that, for example.
mm,
And, most of what I've learned about Wells as a person, because you were asking originally what he was like as a person, comes from becoming
yeah.
friends with people who he was very close to, who knew him personally, like Oya Kodar, like Gary Graver, and so on. So that's how I came to
Mm,
know who he was through them. really.
Right. And when you look back, Jonathan Son, when you were working on the book, what did you perceive was Orson Welles' greatest quality as a director?
His greatest quality, uh,
Yeah.
perpetual inventiveness, I would say. That he was able to create new ideas in whatever project he was involved with. And and that was, yeah, I think that's to me the most impressive quality he had. That he was able to think
Perpetual
beyond the usual
inventiveness.
boundaries, including the commercial boundaries of what, most people work with in the industry.
Right. And what do you think? Where did you perceive any fears of his that were there at that point?
You say any flaws?
Any fears of his? What did he fear as a director?
Well, I think his flaws was basically, he was the kind of person who told almost everybody he knew he was close to, you are the only one I can trust. So it's like, so they're all still suing each other. It's like he was,
Yeah.
at the same time he was living with Oya Kodar, he was married and had a daughter, and alienating them. And so the fact is that he was trying to please too many people. And obviously when you try to do that, there are people who feel cheated and abused and neglected. And I think that that's also created a lot of problems for him.
What was he scared of?
His greatest fear, I guess, his
Yeah.
fear was not being able to finish his films, which he wanted to do, but which he often was unable to do because he didn't know how to handle money, and he would run out of money too soon, and not know how to get more money to go on shooting. That was probably his greatest fear. In other words, he was trying to, having both to keep a wife happy and a mistress happy, and so on.
Right, right. So, do you think, Jonathan, sir, how do you think people are going to remember him for the rest of the span of life on this planet?
So I think one of the things that's fascinating about Wells is that he believed that his greatest tool as an artist was the imagination of his audience. And one part of his genius was his ways of stimulating the imagination of his audience. So in a way, his legacy becomes what our imaginations do with his work, not what, it's sort of like in collaboration with him. So a lot of what his legacy will be and his importance in the future depends on us, not on him. It's on us in creative collaboration with him. Because this was a concept he had from the very beginning, early in his career. He said, there was an interview that I quoted, and actually, I have a book on my essays about Welles called Discovering Orson Welles. And which, by the way, I deliberately made it a title of something that I think is still ongoing. It's not like we're looking for closure. We're in a constant state of discovering Orson Welles when we go to his work. And it's not something that we can put a lid on. But in any case, he said, don't give an audience too much. If you give an audience too much, then they're not creating with you. If you don't give them enough, then they're inventing part of what the show is. When he was a stage director. But it's the same as with film. That basically seducing the audience into using their imagination is his greatest gift. So I think that's one thing that we have to remember, that we're responsible for kind of keeping his legacy going. It's not just him alone by himself.